Welcome to TSAT. Now I am going to discuss a topic on topographical features which are being carved by different agents of weathering and erosion. So here in this context has been projected to you as per the content of the topic is considered. The features which are being formed by fluvial, glacial, Aeolian and wave features. For example, here fluvial here implies that the features which are being formed because of the flowing water, the fluid, the water which is flowing on the surface of the earth is responsible for the formation of different features. In the same way, the glaciers, when they are being moved from the higher elevated region because of the slope gradient, because of the gravitational force, what happens is the glacials move in the valleys of the river. So, because of this reason, the moving glacials are responsible for the formation of different features. Aeolian means wind erosion. So, the moving wind is responsible for carving different features. This wind erosion is dominant in a region which is considered as an arid or a desert. So, in a desert region, the type of erosional activity and the weathering activity is dominant is the wind erosion, which is otherwise also known as Aeolian. And wave, the waves of the ocean, when they are striking the coast, the different features are being formed. So, in this topic, I am going to discuss different features which are being formed by these different agents of weathering and erosion. So, for example, in the case of fluvial landforms, what happens is always water flows, as we know, from a higher elevated region to the lowest possible region. So, in this context, finally, the water aim is to reach the ocean. So, in this process, the flowing water, the main source of this flowing water is precipitation. The rainwater flows from the higher region to the lower region. So, is the main source. So, in this process of flowing, depending upon the topography where precipitation happened, different kinds of features are being formed. For example, when the water is flowing from the higher regions like mountains, what happens is, when you relatively compare the slope gradient, what happens is, the velocity of water flowing depends upon the gradient of the slope. If the slope gradient is more, the velocity of the flowing water will be very high, and the energy is high when the velocity is high. When the energy is high, weathering and eroding capability of the flowing water is high. So, because of this reason, what happens is, when, for example, take the case of India, we have got the river systems like the Ganges, the Indus, when they are flowing from the higher mountainous peaks of Himalayas. When the rivers are flowing on the mountain ranges because of high slope gradient, what happens is the velocity is so high, which leads to the formation of cutting valleys across the mountain regions because of headward erosion. Means the headward erosion where the down cutting is more dominant because of high slope gradient. This leads to the formation of valleys. The valleys, because of this reason, are V-shaped valleys. The shape of the valley will be V-shaped. But by the time when the river reaches the plain, for example, the Gangetic plain, the UP-Bihar plains, the slope gradient, when relatively compared with the slope gradient on the higher Himalayan regions, the slope gradient is less. So, because of this reason, the flow of water velocity is less. In this context, because of the decreasing in the velocity of water, the kinetic energy of the water decreases, the eroding capability of the water decreases. So, because of this reason, what happens is, instead of headward erosion, the lateral erosion dominates. Means the river tries to cut the sides of the valley, leading to the change in the shape of the valley from a V-shaped valley to a U-shaped valley. So, V-shaped valley is a feature of fluvial erosion activity by the flowing rivers. So, this is a valley which is formed in the higher elevated region, which is in the form of a V-shape. But when the slope gradient decreases here, see the picture being shown to you, when the lateral erosion dominates, the sides of the river valley are being cut, being subjected to weathering and erosion, where the V-shaped valley will be converted into a U-shaped valley. So, V-shaped valley is a feature of fluvial activity or the river erosional activity. U-shaped valley is a feature which is being formed by the river erosional activity. So, this is how the different kinds of landforms are being formed. So, in this process, what happens is certain waterfalls are being formed. So, why a waterfall is being formed in the path of the river? The reason behind it is, the reason for the formation of a waterfalls is difference in the nature of the rock, difference in the strength of the rock, as I have specified in the previous episodes regarding the variation in the nature of the rock, where for example, igneous rocks, when relatively compared with any other rock, for example a sedimentary rock, igneous rock might be much more harder than a sedimentary rock. In this process, what happens is the rate of erosion is not the same for these different variant types of rocks. And sedimentary rock which is weak can be subjected to weathering and erosion very easily. So, the rate of erosional activity is very fast for a weaker rock, a soft rock. But for a hard igneous rock body, it also subjects to weathering and erosion, but the time consumed, the rate of erosion in the case of igneous rock bodies is less because of its hard texture. So, what happens is, when a topographical terrain is made up of a resistant rock like a igneous rock body, and this rest of the terrain, the empty terrain or the dotted line terrain, when the beneath the terrain is made up of a soft rock, what happens is, when the soft rock is being subjected to weathering and erosion fast, where the hard rock remaining leads to the formation of waterfalls. So, these waterfalls, because of its energy, leads to the formation of a pool beneath exactly at the spot of the waterfalls, which is known as a pothole or a plunge pool. So, the ditch or a depression which is being formed exactly at the point where the waterfalls is known as a plunge pool or a pothole. So, when there are waterfalls which are continuous waterfalls, where the distance between the waterfalls is very less, we call it as rapids. So, for example, this is an example of a rapid. So, when there is an alternate hard and soft rocks being in a continuous layer, so what happens is, because of this reason, the hard rock is, because of resistance which consumes more time for erosion, will be at a higher elevation, whereas the soft rock will be eroded. So, when there is an alternate arrangement of hard and soft rock continuously, leads to the formation of a kind of continuous small waterfalls being described as rapids. So, in the examination, he may ask you what is a rapid or what is an waterfalls. You must be able to differentiate the reason for the formation of waterfalls and rapids. So, this is a natural pothole because of these waterfalls. Because of the whirlpool being generated in the pothole, the weathering and erosion and the grinding by the pebbles and the rocks increases, and further increasing the circumference of the pothole. So, another aspect which we need to understand here is the river piracy. So, river piracy is, for example, in the first case, for example, at this point, the tributary of the river which is merging into this main river stream, what happens is, when you are able to observe in the second case, the first part is being merged into the second river. There might be a question regarding what do you mean by river piracy. So, for example, in this case of river piracy, when the river is flowing, what happens is, different types of different rivers can be formed in a slope gradient region, depending upon the extent of mountain region or a plateau region. So, in this process of river formation, river is being formed by the merging of many number of tributaries. Tributaries are being formed because of the merger of many number of streams. So, in this process, what happens is, because of the change in the slope gradient, because of tectonic activity or landslides or because of the weathering and erosional nature, what happens is a tributary might change its direction and merge with a different other river because of these phenomena. So, this phenomena of merging of one river's tributary with another different river is known as river piracy. River piracy is also being described as river capture. So, you may get a question, what is meant by a river capture or a river piracy? So, another concept known as structural benches. This is an example of classic example of structural benches. So, what happens is when a river is flowing in the river valley, water is flowing in the river valley, because of lateral erosion, what happens is the river cuts the sides of the valley. So, in this process, because of the variation of seasons and because of n different factors and the amount of precipitation, the volume of water in the river valley will not be constant always. And because of this reason, the water level in the river rises and falls. In this process, the extent of lateral cutting of the river varies when the volume of water is less and the volume of water is more. And apart from this, when with the increasing in the life of a river duration, because of the increasing of weathering and erosional activity over thousands and millions of years, the depth of the river valley gradually increases. So, because of these factors which I have specified in terms of the variation of the volume of water in the river channel or because of the time duration, what happens is the lateral erosion, there will be a kind of benches being cut laterally to the river valley on the other side. These are known as benches. So, these are known as parallel benches when the benches on the either sides are the same, but they are not called parallel when they are not equally being cut. The reason for the variation is on the either side of the river valley, the rocks with which the valley is being made up of might not be the same. When the rocks are made up of different nature, you will not be able to get a parallel benches. So, these are known as parallel benches. So, you may not get a parallel benches on the other side when the rocks are not of the same nature in terms of strength. So, here when the river is flowing from a higher elevated region where the river finally reaches an ocean, the main aim of these agents of erosion, whether it is water or ice or wind, the main aim of these agents of weathering and erosion is to make a peneplain, means to make a graded plane, means they wanted to make the surface area of the earth flat without any differences. That is the main aim of these agents of weathering and erosion. But the agents of weathering and erosion, their aim is being disturbed by the endogenetic forces. What happens is as I have discussed in the previous episodes regarding the endogenetic forces, because of the mountain building process or volcanic activity, the graded plane is being disturbed by this endogenetic activity and leading to different topographical features having a slope gradient. So, when these features dominate, the endogenetic forces, etc., when they dominate, the different kinds of landform features with different gradient topographical features are being formed. When these weathering and erosion dominates, what happens is exogenetic forces dominates, it leads to the formation of a graded plane. So, here when the river is flowing, it tries to eliminate the elevation and it tries to deposit at the lower regions, trying to make a flat graded plane known as a peneplain. So, this plane is known as a peneplain. So, in this process of travel of water from this region to make a peneplain, different structures are being formed. A couple of structures which I have discussed with you is a V-shaped valley or a U-shaped valley or a waterfalls, rapids are formed at the youth stage of a river. So, by the time when the river reaches the plains at the foothills, what happens is when the slope gradient decreases, the energy of the river decreases. the carrying capability of the weathered and eroded material from the silt, boulders, pebbles, etc. Decreases for a river to carry, because by the time the river reaches, for example, in the case of Himalayas, by the time it reaches the plains, what happens is the energy decreases and the load in terms of the weathered material, eroded material carrying by the river, which cannot carry the larger boulders, are being left at the foothills. So these larger boulders with pebbles being left over at the foothills, this is known as 𝗪𝗓. So this 𝗪𝗓, what happens is, because of the large pore spaces between this rocky material, the flowing streams disappear in this 𝗪𝗓, and the disappeared streams reappear, forming a swampy, marshy terrain known as 𝗓𝗏. So 𝗪𝗓 will be at a higher elevated region and 𝗓𝗏 will be at a lower region, which is the resultant of filling up of the pore spaces of the rock with the silt and clay. So the seepage of water decreases and leading to the formation of swamps and water bodies. After that, in the river valley, what happens is, the weathered and eroded material in the form of silt and clay, what happens is, because of the overflowing of the river during the flood seasons, what happens is, the weathered and eroded material expels out of the river bank and settles on the either side of the region. So when the deposited alluvium is near the river valley, it is known as 𝗪𝗏. When the deposited alluvium is older and farther, it is known as 𝗪𝗏. 𝗪𝗏 is relatively considered as more fertile for the purpose of cultivation. So this is how 𝗪𝗓 and 𝗓𝗏, this 𝗪𝗓 and 𝗓𝗏 are being differentiated. Any question can be asked regarding 𝗪𝗓 and 𝗓𝗏, as I have discussed with you. It is the region south of Shivalik Hills. 𝗓𝗏 is the region south of 𝗪𝗓. Any kind of question can be formed. For example, in the second point, very less vegetation is found in 𝗪𝗓. Dense vegetation is found in 𝗓𝗏 region. The width of the region is 8 to 16 kilometers, whereas the width of the region is 20 to 30 kilometers in the case of 𝗓𝗏. Water streams disappear in the case of 𝗪𝗓, whereas water streams re-emerge, which have been disappeared in 𝗪𝗓 region, will reappear in the 𝗓𝗏 region. It is not suitable for cultivation. 𝗪𝗓 is not suitable for cultivation, whereas 𝗓𝗏 is suitable for cultivation. These kind of differences in terms of understanding you need to know, because some questions can be developed on the basis of the difference between 𝗪𝗓 and 𝗓𝗏. Whereas in the case of 𝗪𝗏 and 𝗪𝗓, 𝗪𝗓 is more fertile, 𝗪𝗓 is more older, 𝗪𝗏 is newer when relatively compared with 𝗪𝗓. A question can be developed in this way. So this is how valley evolution happens here. Initially, when the valley is being formed, it is very narrow because of the headward erosion. Because of lateral erosion, gradually the width of the valley increases. This is how the valley shape varies with the change in the rate of weathering and erosion. So by the time, what happens is, when the river load is being left over at the foothills, the deposited material will be left over in the shape of a fan. These are being described as alluvial fans in the plain regions. So this is an alluvial fan being deposited by the river because of the decreasing in the carrying capability and velocity of the river. At this stage, a V-shaped valley, which I have shown to you in the initial stage, now it has been converted into a U-shaped valley because of lateral erosion, because of decrease in the slope gradient. When there is more slope gradient, headward erosion, downward cutting dominates. When the slope gradient decreases, lateral erosion dominates, leading to the formation of U-shaped valleys. So further, when the slope gradient further decreases, further the energy of the river decreases. What happens is, because of this reason, what happens is, the river deposits its load in its own channel. So the river will not be able to flow in the same direction. The river changes its flow of direction. leading to the process of meandering. So, the river makes many number of bends. This phenomena of a bending of rivers because being obstructed by its own river load means the weathered and eroded material is being deposited in its own valley, leading to the meandering of rivers. This structure which is been shown to you is known as meanders. So, when the river is being subjected to meanders in the plain regions, which doesn't happen in the mountainous regions, when there is a floods, again the river energy increases because of the volume, because of heavy downpour, because of heavy rain. So, in this context, what happens is, again the river tries to attain its own river channel direction. So, this has been meandered because of the deposition of its own debris in its river valley. Because of its reason, it changes its direction. Again, because of floods, when the energy increases because of the volume of water, again it's get into its own channel, and it leads to the formation of a temporary lake which is being cut off, known as Oxbow Lake. So, Oxbow Lake is a meandering of rivers, and Oxbow lakes are at a matured stage of a river valley, is a feature of fluvial landforms. So, they may ask you a question, what is an Oxbow Lake, or in which stage of a river you have got these features known as meandering of the river. So, what is a braided strait? A braided strait is the formation of riverine islands, because by the time the river reaches to these plain regions, when the weathered and eroded material is being deposited in its own river valley, it leads to the formation of islands, because the energy of the water decreases because of the decrease in the slope gradient, and leads to the formation of islands. So, the river itself is being divided, braided, channelized between these islands in its own channel. This kind of condition is known as a braided strait or braided channel. These are known as riverine islands. We have got the largest riverine island in the world. In Assam, in Brahmaputra river, they may ask you the largest riverine island is Majuli. Majuli is the largest riverine island in the world, in our country, in the Brahmaputra basin of Assam. Back slopes, so these are known as the back slopes. So, in these back slopes, what happens is, because of the seepage of water percolating, lead to the formation of swamp ecosystem here. At the end, before meeting the ocean, the rivers form deltas. These deltas are named in different ways on the shape of the deltas. So, what happens is, by the time the river divides into different branches, which are known as the distributaries. So, the river is being formed by the combination of tributaries, and this river, by the time it reaches to meet the ocean, the river divides. These branched rivers are known as distributaries. So, you must be able to differentiate between a distributary and a tributary. A tributary is combined to form rivers. River divides to form distributaries. Distributaries are found at the end of the river. Tributaries are found at the formation of a river. That difference you must be able to make. So, here in this context, depending upon the shape of the deltas. So, these deltas, when the river, see this here, the river is being divided into different directions. It may lead to the formation of a triangle. Here, the delta is being formed in the shape of a bird foot. That is the reason why this delta is being described as a bird foot delta. So, because it is in the shape of a bird foot. This is in the case of an abundant delta. So, when a delta is being formed, what happens is, when the accumulation is increasing, what happens is, the river will not be able to overcome its own deposition, and the river changes its direction and forms a different delta. So, the previous delta is being described as an abundant delta when the river stops flowing through this delta. The classic example is Mississippi River in the case of an abundant delta, when the river itself changes its direction. So, the delta is more or less a triangular shaped structure with the different features on the basis of which deltas are being classified. An estuary is an inundated water body from the ocean inside is known as an estuary. A lagoon is being formed by a water inside by a barrier island is known as a lagoon. So, an estuary, a lagoon and a delta, these differences you need to know, where a question can be asked to differentiate these estuary, lagoon and delta. So, this is how deltas are being formed because of the deposition of weathered and eroded material at the mouth of the river. So, this is a region which has been described as a river mouth, where the river is merging into the ocean. So, these are the different features from the higher elevated regions to the river mouth, the different landform features which we have discussed. So, based upon the shape of the delta, they have been classified into arcade delta. So, when the edge of the delta is forming an arc, we call it as an arcade delta. For example, they may ask you a question, for example, the Nile River, what kind of delta it forms. So, for example, the 𝗏 delta, when the delta formed is in the shape of a 𝗏, we call it as a 𝗏 delta. So, this is in the case of a Nile delta. So, this is an example of arcade delta, 𝗏 delta, and the third variant of delta is cusped delta. Cusp means the pointed teeth is known as a cusp. So, as the canine, for example, the variant of teeth which we have got is been described as a cusp. So, when the delta being formed is in the form of a cusp, it is known as a cusped delta. Next type of features being formed by the moving ice. In the case of a mountain, what happens is in the snow falling regions, especially in the higher elevated peaks like Himalayas, what happens is the snowfall which is being accumulated on the mountains. So, for example, previously the mountain is more or less, this is in a peak shape, right? So, this might be an inverted U-shaped structure in this way. Structure is being eroded by the gliding moving ice, which is a glacier, which is being formed by the accumulation of snow. So, what happens is when there is a snowfall, what happens is gradually because of its own compaction and pressure, the snow will be converted into a glacier. And because of the slope gradient, the glacier being subjected to gravity starts sliding. Because of this sliding of this glacier, picks up the material of the slope of the mountain, subjecting to weathering and erosion, leading to carving these a U-shaped mountain into peaks. So, this leads to the formation of different kinds of features. So, on the either side of these mountains in 360 degrees, when it is being carved, forming a sharp ridge-like structures are known as arete. And these arete merging to form a pyramidal peak. So, the gap between two aretes lead to the formation of a kind of lakes known as 𝗂𝗽 lakes. So, these are 𝗂𝗽 lakes which are depressions because of weathering and erosion formed by the plucking of the glaciers. On the surrounding regions of the mountain, this process happens leading to the formation of a pyramidal peak. So, they may ask you what is an arete. An arete is a divide between two 𝗂𝗽 lakes forming a ridge-like structure. A pyramidal peak is a pointed structure meeting of the different aretes surrounding the mountain. A 𝗂𝗽 lake is a depression being formed by the eroded matter caused by the glacier, in a mountain glaciers especially. This leads to the formation of hanging valleys. So, they may ask you what is a hanging valley. So, because the melting ice of glacials, when they are flowing, the eroding capability of this melting water will be less when relatively compared with the moving glacier. So, in the case of these tributaries of the main river, when they are melting, merges into this main river channel. When the main river channel is being formed by the glacial erosional activity. So, because of this glacial erosional activity, because of high physical pressure, and what happens is the erosional rate will be more, leading to deepening of the valley. So, because of the change in the rate of erosional activity of the tributaries, which is less when relatively compared with the mainstream, the depth of the mainstream increases, leading to the waterfalls into the main river by the tributaries. This condition is known as hanging valleys in the glacial erosion, leading to waterfalls and hanging valleys. So, in this context, the moving ice carries the weathered and eroded material beneath. The weathered and eroded material formed by the glacials is known as moraine. So, one of the difference between the weathered and eroded material when relatively compared with the fluvial erosion, that is water and glacials, is water tries to make these rocks smoother and round, whereas the glacial eroded material becomes angular. So, these moraine is angular. So, when this eroded material is on the lateral side is known as lateral moraine. When it is between the glaciers, it is known as medial moraine. So, end moraine or terminal moraine, which is at the end of the glacier. So, in these 𝗪𝗏 basin, what happens is the eroded material is being carried away by the moving glacial, which is been classified as lateral, medial and terminal moraine. So, drumlins are inverted spoon type deposits being made by the melted glacial. So, what happens is with the change in the seasons, what happens is the snow line varies. So, the snow line extends to the lower regions during winter and it recedes during summer. In this process, when the glacials melt, the weathered and eroded material beneath the glacials are being deposited, leading to the formation of inverted spoon-shaped deposits in this region known as drumlins. So, another structure being found by the glacial erosion is known as the 𝗂𝗽𝗓 and the tail structure or sheep rock. This has been described as a sheep rock. So, here in this case, what is happening is when the glacial is moving from a higher region to a lower region, if we have got a rock which is much more harder like granite when relatively compared with other rocks, is resistant to erosion, and what happens is the other rock get eroded very easily, leading to the formation of a 𝗂𝗪 and tail structure. This is known as a 𝗂𝗪, and tail is a soft rock having a less slope gradient. 𝗂𝗪 is having a more steep gradient. This type of rock is known as a sheep rock, which is having 𝗂𝗪 and tail structure, is a resultant of glacial erosion. So, this is a classic example of this. So, these are the different structures which I have discussed with you, being formed by the fluvial erosion, that is water, and the glacial erosion. In the same way, the wind which is dominant in the arid region, means desert region, also forms different variant types of landforms or features. So, because of this activity, the activity is being done by these wind is being described as the weathering and erosional process is being described as deflation, aberration, attrition. So, what happens is the wind which is flowing, what happens is sometimes particles of the sand can be carried away into the air suspending, or if the sand particle is large enough where the sand particle cannot be carried into the air, it somersaults, known as saltation. It moves rotating or sliding on the ground, known as saltation, or sand particle might be dragged, grinding the floor of the desert or a rocky terrain. Or what happens is, because of this flow of mechanical energy of the wind, the sand grains can be carried away from place to place through grinding, sliding, floating, suspension in the air. In this process, certain substantial amount of gravel or sand which is rolling and be able to somersault or saltation strikes the rocks at the lower level more. So, because of this process, for example, the rock which has been shown to you is a mushroom rock, is a structure which is the resultant of Aeolian erosion, which is also known as wind erosion, is a general type of rock. But the lower region is being subjected to weathering and erosion because the gravel and the sand particles strike the lower region of the rock more, because it is at the lower region, leading to weathering and erosion. of the rock beneath, leading to the formation of this structure known as mushroom rock. Mushroom rock has got other names known as rock pedestals or pedestal rock is one and the same. So, in a region where there is sand more, it is being described as barkans. So, here in the case of these barkans are considered, these are crescent shaped sand dunes. Barkans are considered as crescent shaped sand dunes. So, here in this context is formed in a desert dominated by sand. This is an example of a barkan. This is an example of an erg, where large deposits of sand is known as erg. So, in this case, depending upon the directional flow of wind, different shaped sand dunes are formed, a parabolic, longitudinal, etc. So, this is known as a desert pavement. So, here in the case of this desert pavement, the finer particles of the sand are being blown away and a pebble-like angular structures are being left over in a desert. This is a feature being formed which is being described as desert pavement. So, this is known as a 𝗲𝗲𝗃. In the case of 𝗲𝗲𝗃, what happens is a larger boulder-like structures are being remained. When you relatively compare here, the size of the rocky particles being left over are much more larger here. The rest of the finer matter are being weathered and eroded away. This feature is known as a 𝗲𝗲𝗃 in an arid erosion. So, 𝗲𝗏 and 𝗏 and plateau are also found in this Aeolian erosion, or in the case of arid erosion in the desert region. So, a plateau is much more larger one, a 𝗲𝗏 is lesser than a plateau, and 𝗏 is much more lesser than a 𝗲𝗏. So, this is also found in Aeolian erosion or wind erosion regions. These are structures which are found in this wind erosion. So, 𝗏𝗏𝗃 is a structure which is formed because of weathering and erosion in the Aeolian erosion or wind erosion in the desert region, where the difference between 𝗏𝗏𝗃 and 𝗧𝗏𝗃 is because of soft and hard rocks. So, for example, horizontally when there is a hard and soft rock, it leads to a longitudinal resistant rocks known as 𝗏𝗏𝗃s. But vertically when there is alternative soft and hard rocks, it leads to the formation of a 𝗧𝗏𝗃 kind of structure. So, this is known as a blowout. So, in the case of a blowout, in the case of a desert, what happens is the fine particles are being weathered and eroded away, leading to the formation of a depression. This depression in the desert, when it rains, lead to the formation of oasis in the case of desert. These kind of lakes in the deserts are being described as playas. Playas evaporate during the summer season. Accumulation of salts in the playa lakes. So, friends, we shall meet in the next session and discuss another topic in geography.